Hello, and welcome to week 3 of our spiritual quest. This is following a new creed from the United Church of Canada. We are not alone. We live in God's world. We believe in God who has created and is creating, who has come in Jesus, the Word made flesh. Who has come in Jesus? That's the title of session 3 this week. Come in Jesus. And so we're talking about the history of Jesus and how we know what we know about him. And we begin by asking questions, of course. Why? Why is Jesus so important? And can we really know anything about him? What was he like? What did he teach? And the biggie, is it okay if I don't believe everything that I hear about Jesus? So we'll begin at the beginning. There's a widely circulated appraisal of Jesus that goes like this. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then, for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a home. He didn't go to college. He never lived in a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place he was born. And he did none of the things that usually accompany greatness. He led no armies. He managed no countries. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion rose against him, and his friends ran away from him. One of them denied knowing him. He was turned over to his enemies, and he went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between 2 thieves, and while he was dying, his executioners gambled for his garments, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave, thanks to the pity of a friend. 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the central figure of the Christian religion and the human race. In modern-day Canada and many parts of the world, church attendance is declining. The religious meaning of Christmas and Easter has been replaced with Santa Claus and the bunny. Religion has been removed from public school. People might recognize caricatures of Jesus, pictures of the beard, the rope, and the sandals, but fewer and fewer people know very much about him. Excuse me for a second. A cat trapped in the office. So reasonable people want information. Before they commit to anything, they want to find out. They want to know what it's all about. So it seems reasonable to ask a few questions before we commit to ourselves in following him. So which of these statements do you think might be plausible? Which do you believe in? Jesus never existed at all. Or Jesus was a human being. Jesus was a miracle worker. Jesus was a profound philosopher. Jesus was a pawn of those who wanted to start a new religion. So what do you think? Consider your answers. What are the things that you believe? So while history may not be everybody's favorite subject, I know it's certainly not mine, there is no denying the importance of history in shaping how we see ourselves. If we identify ourselves as coming from a certain country, we take on the history of that country. When we speak a language, we connect ourselves to the collected experience of those who formed that language. And when we use our name, we invoke the involvement of our lives in those who named us, our birth families, or adopted families, those who we might have chosen to become family with. So here's what we know about Jesus. Jesus was a Jew of his day. He would have attended synagogue on the Sabbath and learned some of the ancient Hebrew language. He would have heard all of the ancient stories of his people, stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Joshua and so on. He would have heard these being read aloud from scriptures in the temple. And in fact, he would have read some of them in the temple himself. He would have heard commentaries of the Hebrew prophets and the wisdom of the Hebrew poets. By the time he was 12, he would have known the history of his nation. He would have known that the Assyrians had destroyed Israel, the nation comprised of the 10 northern tribes. They were completely gone. And a little more than a century later, the Babylonians captured the remaining southern 2 tribes in Judah, exiled the leading citizens to Babylon for re-education, and they were allowed to return some 70 years later. Jesus would have known that for 4.5 centuries, the walls of Jerusalem had been restored at the permission of the Babylonian conquerors, and that Judaism had resumed a political life. Jesus would have known that the Jews returned from exile and settled in the southern area of Judea, and for those who remain had intermarried with the locals in Samaria, and that some had migrated north of Samaria to the area around the Sea of Galilee. Jesus would have also heard that over the 3 centuries before his day, Jerusalem and the rest of the world had been overrun by the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and how in the centuries after the death of Alexander, the land of the Jews had first been ruled by people from Egypt and then by those from Syria. Jesus would have been acquainted with the heroic tales of Judas the Hammer, under whose leadership the Jews had lived free for most of a century until the Roman Empire occupied their land and called it Palestine. Jesus, like most of the Jews in the land of Palestine, would have spoken Aramaic, a Middle Eastern dialect, and Greek, left over from the days of Alexander. Culturally, Palestine was a confluence of Hebrew faith, Greek culture, Roman law. According to most scholars, Jesus lived from about 6 BCE to about 27 CE. So, how do we know anything about Jesus? Well, certainly from the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. But we also know that Jesus was mentioned by Jewish scholars, by Roman historians, and by people who wanted to destroy the Christian religion. The 4 Gospel writers, Mark was possibly a companion of the leading disciple of Jesus, Peter, he wrote his gospel first, probably 20 or 30 years after Jesus' ministry. And he did it by putting together a dramatic chronicle of the events in the last months before the crucifixion. Matthew was likely a first century Christian associated with the original disciple of that name. And he wrote his gospel for fellow Jews at a time when the number of non-Jewish disciples of Jesus was beginning to grow rapidly. Luke was probably the traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, and he may have been writing a gospel for use in the congregations that disciples of Paul had established. And both Matthew and Luke made use of Mark's recollections and at least one other common source that contained a collection of Jesus' teachings on various subjects. John, whose work claims to reproduce the recollection of the original disciple named John, wrote his account of ministry toward the end of the first century, so almost 100 years after Jesus' death. And he expanded on the theological implications of Jesus' life and death. So tomorrow, when we get back together, we'll talk about some of the work that Jesus did, how he died, and how the myths and legends and so on have evolved over time. Thank you for being with me today, and we'll get back to this sometime tomorrow.